Howdy, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the Austrian Audio Hi-X60, or is it the Hi-X60? I'm not actually sure, but this is a closed back studio monitor headphone that's coming in at around 430 bucks. And now I know there is no shortage of closed back studio monitors out there. Most of them cost about half of what this one costs here. But if I'm perfectly honest, I don't really love any of the closed back studio monitors that you're typically used to hearing about. The AKG K371, the Biodynamic DT770, the Sony MDR 7506, etc. Those are all kind of legends in the space, but I don't really love listening to them. But I was curious if going up in price range would make me feel a little bit different. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've had this thing for about a month, maybe even longer. I've been listening to it and comparing it with some other headphones that I've got here on hand. And we'll talk about exactly how I think they stack up against them. But just, I guess, a reminder, if you forgot, this is a live stream, like all my other reviews. If you have any questions about the Hi-X60, anything else that we talk about, please do leave it in the live chat. And at the end of the review, we're going to spend some time and have a little bit of a conversation, hopefully answer all your questions. But with that out of the way, I guess a quick shout out to Austrian Audio for sending this in for review. If you want to check out the Hi-X60, I've got it linked in the description down below. But let's dive to the table and start talking about the physical stuff. Then we'll talk about the sound, what I like, what I don't like, and then we'll bring in those comparisons for the direct head-to-head. So the packaging is here. It's quite large for my table. Oh my gosh, it doesn't really fit. Use your imagination. It's a big box. And it's got a pair of headphones in it. And this is what you should expect inside there. Not a ton of accessories, but about as much as you would need, frankly. You get a nice little soft carrying pouch, which is a nice touch. I think that's actually not a bad way to carry your headphones, especially for like a studio monitor like this. This is kind of meant to be a rugged studio durable thing, not necessarily a precious thing. So that's pretty good. You also get two different cables. You've got the cable that I've got on here, which is your standard sort of portable length cable. I would say it's about 4 feet long, ends and terminates into a 3.5 millimeter connection. Or you can use this very long cable, which you can see I didn't even bother to unwrap because I'm not a big fan of long cables personally, but that's because I don't work, okay, I'm here technically in a studio, but I don't work in a professional environment where I need a really long cable. If you need it, it's in the box. There you go. And it does come with well, it's still a 3.5 millimeter termination, but it comes with a screw-on 6.3 millimeter adapter for all your serious studio work. The other thing that's worth calling out about this cable is, well, obviously there are two in the box, which means that it is removable. You can replace the cable on this headphone, and the connection type that they chose is a 2.5 millimeter twist lock style. This does appear to be compatible with cables from the Sennheiser HD560S that I have, because I did, for a lot of the time I was using this, I used the cable from my 560S, just because this cable it's actually not bad, but you can see it's a little bit on the kinky side, a little bit on the stiff side. Honestly, it's kind of par for the course for headphone cables. It's a decent cable, but it's not my favorite cable, and that's why I preferred using an aftermarket cable that I bought from my 560S, which is thankfully compatible here. But apart from that, okay, that's enough talking about the cable. Let's talk about the headphone itself. And I would say that build materials on this thing do feel a little bit nicer than the build materials you'll get on most of the closed back monitors that I talked about being, below this price range. This is about, I would say, like 50% metal and 50% plastic. Like here on the headband, this is still plastic, but this all around here is a nice metal band. And then here in the cups, the bulk of the cups is made out of plastic, but then this back right here is made out of metal, and the yokes here are a nice, very solid metal as well. Generally pretty good build materials. Like, it feels solid in the hands, and it doesn't feel overly weighty or anything like that. It does also have a fairly basic folding mechanism in the event that you need to fold these into a small something or other. And other than that, I mean, let's see, I'll comment briefly on the aesthetics because this is going to be kind of a personal thing. I think this thing is an okay looking headphone. It's a little bit industrial looking, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I don't know, there's something about the proportions to me that just don't look quite sexy. Again, it's a well-built headphone. I think it looks decent. Like it certainly doesn't look cheap or anything like that. But aesthetically, I feel like it could use a little bit more. It does have, you know, these red logos on here, which aren't the best contrast against the black background, but maybe that's intentional. Maybe it's meant to be just kind of a low-key studio monitor, which I suppose they've achieved. But that will lead us into talking about fit and comfort of this headphone, and that's actually where this thing I think excels quite a bit. It is a closed back headphone, so it is intended to be used in locations where sound isolation is important for you. And I would say that the sound isolation on this is actually pretty good. It's a little bit better than some of the other closed backs that I have on hand. I wouldn't say that it's gonna like knock out your expectations as far as noise isolation. I use IEMs all the time, and I feel like IEMs generally do a better job of isolating, at least for the frequencies that I frequently encounter. But yeah, generally I don't think anyone's going to have, if you're looking for a closed back monitor, the isolation on this thing is pretty good. Maybe even more importantly though, well, at least more importantly for me, would be the roominess of the cups, which is actually really, really good. They are a very deep ear cup, which I don't know if that's totally going to come across on here, but there is plenty of room top to bottom, side to side, and especially depth wise, so that my ear just doesn't really come anywhere close to touching this, and that is quite nice. So yeah, generally just a very solid, comfortable headphone to wear for long periods of time, and it isolates, which again, if that's the thing that you're looking for, well, it does that job. So that's about as much as I can say about the physical stuff here, I believe. Let me just check my notes real quick to make sure I didn't miss anything, but no, that looks like it's. So let's dive in and talk about the sound. And like I typically do, we'll start by describing just the general sound signature, and then we'll get into the details about what I like and don't like about it. And the general sound signature that you should expect on the Hi-X60 is kind of a somewhat bright neutral with a fairly significant sub-bass boost. I would describe it, I mean, that kind of just sounds like I'm maybe describing it as like a V-shaped sound signature, but I would honestly describe it more as mid-rangey. So where that bass emphasis is and where that treble emphasis is kind of comes a little bit too far out to be your classic traditional V-shaped sound signature, and maybe you could call it a U-shaped sound signature, I suppose. But I just think overall it comes across primarily as somewhat of a bright neutral sound. So what do I like about the sound here on the Hi-X60? Well, that tuning choice, honestly, I like that. And if this is going for a studio monitor use case, so you want something that is ostensibly some version of neutral, it's not too flavored, and I think they hit that, and they've got a pretty significant sub-bass boost on this too, which, because it is so well isolated into the sub-bass, it never comes across in terms of like smearing up the mid-range, you know, giving you that dreaded bloat or anything like that. And it gives you a decent representation of those sub-bass rumbles without compromising the fact that this is, again, intended to be a neutral monitor headphone. And so, yeah, I think it's just generally all around a good tuning choices on this. Maybe it could do with a little bit less of the mid treble. It doesn't really come across necessarily as fatiguing for me. I did find that the treble is generally pretty smooth. It just tonally comes forward maybe a little bit too bright. But what do I not like about the sound here on the Hi-X60? And while I like the tune on this thing quite a bit, honestly, I think the technical performance on this thing is just kind of typical closed back technical performance, which is why I mentioned up front that I don't really love any of the more common closed back monitor headphones. I like a neutral sound signature. That is my jam. I want neutral. But closed back monitors just, I don't know. They haven't really nailed the technical performance. And unfortunately, I think the Hi-X60 doesn't really move the needle there. I think there is somewhat of a lack of separation between sounds broadly. I think that tonal balance is maybe a little bit on the lean side. So it's not, I don't know, it's just not like a very dynamic sort of mobile, visceral sound really at all. It's just kind of a flat, neutral, boring sound, which I guess is maybe what some people expect from neutral. But again, as a neutral head myself, I know that neutral doesn't have to be boring, but unfortunately I would say that the Hi-X60 is, in my opinion, on the boring side. So those are my general thoughts here on the Hi-X60. But like I mentioned, we're going to bring in some competitors as I clear my table off quite subtly here. You didn't hear that, don't worry about that. Bring in some competitors and talk about how this headphone compares directly to some of those other closed back monitors that you may or may not have familiarity with. And we can see that my table is struggling to fit these all into view, but use your imagination. No, let's describe these, all right? So here, of course, we've got the Austrian Audio Hi-X60, closed back studio monitor, dynamic driver, $430. Here is the AKG K371, also an Austrian headphone, but I don't believe this one's actually made in Austria, while this one is. Also a dynamic driver studio monitor headphone, but price range is quite a bit lower. This is about $175, right? So less than half the cost of that. And then finally over here, we have the Beyerdynamic DT770 Pro, also a closed back studio monitor, dynamic driver. Price range on this one is the cheapest of the bunch at $160. And now to some degree, this price comparison isn't entirely fair because this headphone's been around a long time. I don't know what it originally was priced at, but I don't think it was $160. And this one's been out for a while, so I think its price has come down maybe like $30 or something versus where it was. But still, nevertheless, they are half the cost of the Austrian Audio. So how do they compare in terms of tonal balance? Like how are the tuning choices between them different? And they are, even though they are all studio monitors, they all do it differently. The Austrian Audio X60, again, I would kind of describe as somewhat of a bright neutral sound signature. It does have that sub bass emphasis, but because it is so well isolated into the sub bass, there's not a lot of body behind the sound, and again, you're not ever risking anything approaching mid bass bloat or anything like that. It is somewhat a little bit on the lean side, and mostly though, I think the mid range is kind of the most prominent aspect of the sound here. In fact, I would say of the bunch on the table, I'm just gonna go ahead and say right now, this is my favorite in terms of tuning. The AKG K371, in contrast, is kind of commonly described as a Harman neutral sound signature, but I gotta be honest, I really don't think so. Like, to me, this just kind of sounds like somewhat of a warm neutral. It's bassy, right? This is a bassy sounding headphone, bassier than Harman neutral typically is, and overall gives it more of a warm, kind of a thick sound versus this being kind of a bright and lean sound, right? That's kind of a pretty significant difference between these two. And then the Beyerdynamic DT770 maybe is somewhere in between. This is more of like a V-shaped sound signature, if I'm honest. And it's the most contrasty of the two, or of the three here on the table. It's got a lot of kind of mid and upper treble emphasis, and it's got quite a bit of bass emphasis that doesn't start as late as the bass emphasis does here, so you get more of that mid bass punch here. But because of that, again, you just get more of that contrasty sound, which makes it a little bit more V-shaped in its tonal balance. And frankly, I don't know, that's how they differ. In terms of technical performance, there are also some pretty significant differences here. Again, the Austrian Audio, it's pretty middling closed back technical performance. If I'm honest, it is not especially bad, but it is also not especially good. You know, it's got that clean tonality, but just really little separation between sounds. Like if you're looking for anything approaching soundstage or really strong imaging, I don't think that the Hi-X60 is going to impress you above anything that any other headphone half its cost would honestly achieve. The AKG K371, honestly, again, this is known as somewhat of a Harman neutral sound signature. I don't really think it's that, and I just really don't love this headphone. I don't think the technical performance is very good either. I think it's kind of a mushy, muddy mess. The mid-range is especially like vocal content, it just comes across kind of low res. And so, I don't know, I wanted to love this headphone, but I've had this for a couple of years now at this point. I just never listened to it because it's just kind of meh to me. And then the DT770, I would actually say, even though this is the cheapest one on the bunch, I would say the technical performance in this is my favorite. It's got the best sense of separation between sounds, the best sense of head stage. It's not going to blow you away, again, if you're used to open back headphones. I don't think it's going to approach that. But versus these two others, which just sound kind of flat and dull and two-dimensional, there's at least some, dimensionality to the sound here on the 770. The bass also has, I think, a pretty nice leading edge punch to it, partly because, again, the emphasis is happening a little bit sooner in the bass frequencies and not just entirely in the sub bass frequencies. And I think also that somewhat, sharp treble emphasis is contributing to a perception of better technical performance here, but it does come at the expense of fairly fatiguing treble, if I'm perfectly honest. I think that this might get better with worn pads. This is a brand new headphone, and if I squish it on top of my ears, like as if to sort of simulate the pads being a little bit more broken in, it does seem like the treble cools off a little bit and starts to be more listenable. But I will say that as it is out of the box, the treble is pretty fatiguing and sharp on this headphone. And then how do they compare in terms of form factor? Well, let's talk about the X60 again. We already described it fairly in depth, but I think that the build quality on this one does stand out of the bunch. Does it feel like it costs twice as much in the hand? I don't know, maybe. Honestly, yeah. I think this does feel like a better built headphone, even though it's still plastic. The materials in this feel nicer. It does have that folding mechanism, which is nice. I think aesthetically it would probably just be my biggest quibble with the build on this thing. It looks fine, but it doesn't look fantastic. The AKG K371, in contrast, is a lot more plastic to the hand, although this metal yoke part right here is metal. I just described it as metal. But despite the fact that this is all plastic, I actually think this feels pretty nice in the hands. It's just got a lot of really soft touch materials on it, right? Whether it's this cold metal here, the very large pads, which when you're handling this headphone, mostly you're touching the pads and they have this nice soft touch to them, or even the headband, which is wrapped in kind of a faux leather. I don't know if that comes across here, but kind of a faux leather. Like the whole headphone just feels a little bit on the soft and plush side, which I like. In terms of fit, it doesn't necessarily seal the best for me down here near my jawline, but generally pretty comfortable. I'd say the ear pads don't have quite the room of the Austrian Audios, but I do kind of like the seal on these ear pads when I can get it to seal. I don't know, decent build quality. I will say that there were some issues with reliability or just consistency with this headphone initially when it came out. That was a couple years ago. I haven't kept up with it enough to know if that is still a problem, but I would feel a little bit disingenuous to not mention it now. And then finally, the DT770 Pro. Of the bunch, this one feels kind of the most lightweight and plasticky feeling. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of like Grado build quality in terms of just being like these cheap plastic cups, but it also doesn't feel not durable. Like it feels kind of appropriate. Like I like these really large, even though they're thin metal. This is a metal yoke here. I do dig that. Plastic cups, I could ignore that. I think probably where this thing feels the cheapest is just this headband cover that has this, maybe you can tell that's kind of like this pretty plasticky fake leather look on it. The ear pads are pretty big and roomy, maybe not a ton in terms of depth wise, but they are pretty big and roomy, and they are what do you call this, a velvet or a velvet's not quite the right word, a velour pad, whereas these are kind of like a fake pleather. I would say that long-term wise, these are not as comfortable for me because of that. It can get a little bit on the scratchy side, but as far as velours go, this is actually one of the better velours, if I'm honest. The other thing I'll just mention is that this is the only headphone here on the table that doesn't fold up. There's no folding mechanism, and the cable is not removable. So there you go. Again, in terms of build quality, this one would be my favorite, but I don't know, they're not all massively different. So that is going to do it for my thoughts here on the Austrian Audio Hi-X60. Out of 5 stars, I'm going to give it, it's a solid 3-star headphone. It's a decent headphone. It does the job. It is a closed back monitor with good isolation and a neutral sound signature, which is kind of what you should want for this product category. But if you're looking for something that is technically engaging, unfortunately, I don't think that spending more money on the Austrian Audio really gets you that. Really what it gets you is better build quality and a different tonality, different tonal balance, which may or may not be exactly what you're looking for. I would say I prefer it slightly, but kind of only slightly. That said, if you're interested in checking out the Austrian Audio Hi-X60, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down, please hit the like button if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Unless you're here live, in which case hang out, we'll have a chat.